A memory, she tells me, my nervous childhood stomach made sick by a prairie storm. Now in a space on the other side and looking back, across the flat plain of before, toward the curved structure of my small body, writhing on the couch, surrounding what I could not manage to say. Growing up takes a little bravery, and that's all I had. She always had more. She tells me about a drive straight toward adulthood that I slept through. Now, grown, how to follow that long way back along the tire tracks to where I left off. She was the other passenger with whom I shared a distance, but not time. How to retrace a relationship and then to stay present. How to repair. I always push away from the pain, but she reaches through and can see me, can connect what I can't by a very long road. I started writing the book that would become Swollening in 2018 as I was finishing my master's degree. I was composing these poems alongside the writing of my master's thesis that was interested in similar topics and concerned with similar questions that were imposing themselves on me more urgently. How do I live alongside illness and pain that seemed to be coming from nowhere? There was evading diagnosis that seemed to be going nowhere as well. It was persistent and it was chronic. What do I do with this queerness and this gender that I hadn't looked at too closely, that I was maybe disciplined and reduced by, a kind of masculinity that I internalized while growing up in Alberta? Where does my body sit on this field when these are the conditions that are at the axes? As I was writing poem after poem, I began to organize them by theme, against my own biography. So my own life, it became a very personal collection. How could it not, given what I was writing about and thinking through? And so this book settled into 3 sections. Section 1, things swallowed. My childhood and adolescence. Growing up queer in Alberta, a place that hasn't historically been hospitable to queerness, and that still isn't hospitable to queerness. And as the title of the section suggests, I'm interested in all of the bad feelings and bad affects, anxieties and fears and desires that I swallowed in order to navigate Alberta in the 90s and 2000s when I was growing up. All these things that I internalized and have settled into my body, shaping who I've become. Earring. Coming to return to your imprint, you, half shadowed by lamplight, am scared of being a fag. Your child coming home pierced, your voice all the way through the wound that never grows over. Where one can hang things, the loop of silver, the ball, the night heavy like an apple, bending the bow, the bow strung straight. But what if I am? A quiver through the left lobe. We never could hear one another. Perched on the side of your bed, where I tried to be understood as much as I understood myself at that age, and failing. Neither of us could move beyond the syllable. It trapped us. I could not even say it myself, but you could see wounds all over me. Oh, here. Oh, another, counting the spoiled fruit that is such a waste. Time sharpened in all directions and still stays sharp. A full apron at the side of your bed and nothing in it. So much for us to inventory and barter over. Finally, my father says enough. All he wants is to know that he can. And the long exchange ends with us holding only what we brought in the first place, Nothing has changed hands. We are both still wringing our fears. A good father says, "You are my son," and reaches across to touch the burning wound. On May 18th, 2019, I came here to Latitude 53 and saw Kyle Terrence's short film and exhibition, Berta Boys. The artist's statement describes the show as contemplating the teetering instability of Alberta's hypermasculine identity, noting that the exaggerated posturing of masculinity has fused Alberta's aesthetic and economic identities into a petrophilic culture that is put on display via hypermasculine regionalisms. I was immersed, standing in front of one of Kyle's drawings depicting a truck with large, heavy truck nuts hanging, a truck turned sentient and slain by this masculinity. Berta Boys, after Kyle Terrence's Berta Boys, viewed at Latitude 53, Edmonton, Alberta, May 18th, 2019. A masculinity that cannot go further. The length of it more than its language. Here, arms at the side and holding straight, down, forgetting the lick that breezes over. Smoke plumes, gravity makes itself known over a scene, an absence, a way of being gendered, some unsound distance, smoking on the corner, pencil, and then something darker, marking you, exposing you, the weight of balls pulling you down towards something you can't see, but that bruises nonetheless. From an Instagram post dated May 24th, 2019, Terrence writes, "Alberta is a region whose history and economy is rooted in the frontier mythos, colonialism, and resource extraction. Because of this, its landscape is not simply a neutral background for events to unfurl, but rather a primary character in a narrative of regional identity, an entity cyclically exploited by masculine desire." I stood in the gallery and saw around me so much of my landscape, the whiteness and the toxic masculinity. And then I was also able to read into the art bits of queerness. There was a ball cap with the words oil cash embroidered on it, in orange and gold, worn by one of the characters in the film, pierced by arrows. A disembodied Saint Sebastian, patron saint of the gays, whose penetration by arrows, the broken boundary between flesh and the outer world, which has become somewhat iconic in the history of art, ringing in my eyes. It is what turns you into a sick room without power, a flickering body whirring toward activity and participation in spite of itself. Pain is what interferes, what cuts up time, attention, language, so the mind is only half there while the body throbs its excess presence. It is what fragments a life with too much punctuation, sharp intakes of breath that are held, the drag of the semicolon across your clauses, its guts hanging from the bottom of your tired voice, that looks like it's bleeding. Colon from the Greek kolon, meaning limb, that which can reach and hold two independent ideas, that one can be sick and still made to participate in its own extraction, production, interrupted, sleep, conversations, thoughts. The mind moves toward the minute, the particular, the boring, all to keep the body in place, to return the world to a size that can be managed. Pain can be too big. You make connections you would never make in health. You see from the ground what the wells step over. There is only enough of you for the very small. You leave gaps in your logic for those shafts of light to move through, dust dancing. And when you record the experience of your body, you are not making sense. That is not the language of pain. Section 2. Being sick, zooming in tight to the body, trying to put language to an embodied experience that was all-consuming, that I felt at every layer of myself, that was alienating and didn't make sense. I wrote swollening from bed, the way sick and disabled and crypt writers always have, using poetry to navigate the muddy space I found myself in, moving from reckoning to mourning, and now toward learning about disability justice, care webs, that kind of intimate relationship that can be joyful. It's only in the last couple years that I've settled into the identity of being chronically ill. At first, I believed being sick was temporary, that I would recover, that the doctor's appointments I went to and the tests that I underwent and the medications that I tried would amount to something and I would be my old self again. But doctors weren't able to offer any diagnosis, saying that they couldn't find anything wrong, that it must be anxiety or stress, something nebulous like that, or my imagination. Waiting room 2. Populated by sick, patient spirits, a roll call of our hidden ailments from behind a partition. I blow into a tube that fogs. The nurse smiles absently while she fixes the stopper and files it away. Animals live in it now. Microbes homing against sterile glass grow and die in captivity. Someone will watch them from a critical distance and report that they were saved from a collapsing ecosystem, or that I am healthy after all. Back in the holding cell, a distant cough into the bored air. I came to know Chelsey Campbell through seeing their work at Latitude 53. Stunning, delicate pieces of laser-etched tissue in soft colors with text that reads, "Queer crypt magic, crypt time all the time, and let the body lead." Like with Kyle's work, I felt instantly seen. Access intimacy, the feeling between disabled crypt sick folks of understanding, having your access needs known and understood, that comes with electric suddenness and relief. Chelsey Campbell is a disabled white settler Canadian artist and researcher working in mediums of printmaking, drawing, photography, sculpture, installation, and digital media. Their artist statement describes their work as examining their body as both a medical object and a social construct, exploring the liminal space between patient and person, body and self. Drawing from their intimate history with chronic pain and disability, they are interested in the tenuous nature of the disabled body within social and medical frameworks fixated on diagnosis and cure. Building a relationship with Chelsey, coming to know other disabled crypt and sick writers and artists, does what good literature also does. Allows me to make connections with my deeper self and to one another, gives me a language to understand the world, helps me find joy, relationship, and care. I would like to ask you a bit about your artistic process.
Yeah.
Because your work has sort of become this newfound source of joy and inspiration and comfort for me. I would love to talk to you about that and learn more about these prints because just they have sort of lit up my world in this new way.
So nice.
Because I'm very new, I feel, to coming through the sort of reckoning phase of living with chronic illness, like realizing that it's something that isn't actually going to go away.
Yeah.
And now I'm entering this space where it feels more joyful and liberatory. And I feel like your work has been a sort of portal for me.
Oh, that's so
in getting there.
So nice to hear.
So I would love to hear about that and these prints in particular because they are so joyful. They're so light and colorful, and they're so, the phrases that you use are so liberatory, and that would mean a lot to me to hear about.
So, I mean, I position my work, I think I've also gone through that stage of reckoning. And for me, this work was like also a transformational moment for me. So it feels like it's so tender to know that that resonated with you as well, as somebody who's gone through that similar process of like reckoning with illness, reckoning with a failing body and what that means. And so this work, I wanted to think about it as almost celebratory bunting of like hanging on the thread, these like beautiful moments that I've captured from being in community, in Crip communities. So a lot of it centers this kind of like intangible moment of queer Crip magic when we all get to share space together and you have that moment of access intimacy where we just know each other intimately, immediately, and that access point is so tangible. And so this work was really an opportunity for me to like celebrate that moment of community and of recognizing my position in it. I think that was what was the most transformational moment, was sitting in this Zoom call, because of course, hello, our lives now, sitting in this Zoom call, and I was just taking notes as we were kind of talking, and these kind of phrases about our bodies and embodiment were coming out, recognizing that I had the same feelings and that I belonged in that space with others was just pure joy. Like I can't even express what that felt like to sit in that space and go, oh, this is it, this is my community. And that it was also a moment of reckoning for me of like how long I've been waiting to be in community. And like, as somebody who identifies as queer Crip, like coming to terms with my queerness and finding my place in that, in particular as a non-binary person, and trying to figure out, like, you already exist in this liminality. So how do you find your place when you're constantly, like, your identity itself is liminal? And then to find Crip community and have that like moment of instant grounding was just the most powerful thing. And so then this work gave me an opportunity to just celebrate and uphold and like feel joy as resistance, which I think is one of the most powerful materialities any like disabled, queer, mad, Crip, sick person can do, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that access intimacy is precisely what I felt the minute I walked into Latitude 53 and saw these on the wall. And I think as I was reviewing Swollening in preparation for our conversation and you know, just kind of reacquainting myself with something that I'd written 4 years ago, it was like night and day. Like it was really marking time. Like here I was trying to come to terms with a lot, and not just with, you know, being sick, but also other liminal identities, like you say, like my queerness, my gender. You know, I'm non-binary as well, and these were all things that I felt like I didn't have access to or language for, and so the collection really felt like me trying to, kind of like sift through all of this stuff that had settled, but I didn't have anywhere to look to make sense of how to organize it. And your work really did that for me, and it's just so powerful, and it really, as somebody who doesn't work in visual art and visual art mediums, being able to look at something and to see it just so immediately and so materially, like you say, is so powerful and so moving to me. And I'm really grateful that you share this, and that this is the art that you make, because people need it. I really needed it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel the same when I read your book. Was again, that access intimacy. And I think we had that before we even spoke, right? Like I saw you post on Instagram and I was like, this is already a person I need to be in community with. And then when we had our first conversation, it was so effortless. And I felt the same when I had your book of being in community with you and like understanding those moments, those like really tangible moments of like the anger and grief and sadness and sometimes beauty of illness, right? And that your book captured those really powerful, transformative moments, and that without those kind of that moment of grief and loss, you wouldn't get to the next step, which is this moment of like resistance and finding community and putting language to it. Like that's something we've talked about before, is like how do you how do you find like the word or the language that like immediately clicks for you? And I remember when I came across queer crip theory, and it was just like, oh yeah, okay, shut it down. Like, this is it. This is my people. This is like how I can frame myself. And it was instantaneous. And I felt the same in the book of like that instant, like I saw so much of myself in it and like so much of my community in it. And that's such a gift. Like, that's radical generosity, right? Like extending care out by being so transparently present in your words. Like, oh, it's so nice.
Aww.
It's such a gift.
Well, and like what I find your work does for me is it allows me to see that third section of the book, certainly like the last part of that third section, where all the poems shift to right alignment because it's to mark a real different perspective. Yeah. Like, I have moved on to this other space of joy and liberation and community and care, and that's what your work does for me, and your friendship and your community does for me. Like, it makes me feel like this space that I was really writing toward for the whole collection, and really at Josh's, my editor Josh's urging, really let myself go toward. Yeah. Because there are so many obstacles, even if you can intellectualize something or you feel something, bringing it all together, the mind, the body, it's hard to do without that community network, those webs of care. And it really makes me excited for whatever the next stage of our work will look like, because I don't know that I don't know if I could have seen myself getting here the way that I did. And I mean, I feel such a different embodied feeling. Sitting here looking at this art, sitting here with you talking.
So nice. One of my favorite lines I think about all the time is from Sonia Huber's book, Pain Woman Takes the Keys and Other Stories from Nervous System. And they have this great line that just says, there are so many of us among you. And like, that's it. Like, that's totally true. Like, we are here. We inhabit every space and every role, but we don't often feel like we have the authority to hold that space and to make space for others. And I think that's what, like, I try to do in my work, but I can see in your work as well, is like this really assertive holding of space, and the complexity of what holding that space looks like too, right? It's not a simple act, and especially when we're talking about it from this lens of like whiteness, right? It's not a easy conversation to have, but I think you're holding space in such a sensitive, beautiful way. And I think about your poem, Ruinous Women, towards the end. And like, I felt the same, like when I read that poem, like I have so much gratitude for the ruinous women that have guided my practice, right? That these queer femmes of color are the reason that I'm here. These ruinous women have dismantled these systems of oppression. And so when I read that poem, I was just like, it felt so nice to feel that same care in your book. So I loved that moment. For me, that's how I found my community, was not through a physical dialogue that was happening, although there were like intangible threads, kind of same thing, guiding me down that path. But like, it was books that I found myself and found my community. So I think your book is just such a radical act of care, because this is going to be an opportunity for somebody else to see themselves and to connect themselves in that community and into this broader framework that you exist. And especially like, and we've talked about this before, but having it under Arsenal Pulp Press, like what a gift, because immediately it's attached to this whole body of like revolutionary, radical works about queer, crip politics and just community and care work. Like, I think about the fact that your book now is connected to Leah Lakshmi Pevsina Sinha, and like, I am screaming inside constantly, but also like, what a gift for anybody who reads that book and then may find their way to thinking about disability justice and how we can think about radical transformation and care. That's beautiful.
It's another network.
Yep.
It's another like care web. I mean, as I was sort of understanding that what I was feeling was in fact chronic illness, and that it was chronic, it was persistent, it wasn't going anywhere, it was evading diagnosis, all of these things. I wasn't sure how I would fit in a community.
Yeah.
I don't know how common this is, but for me, I felt as though perhaps like, do I really belong in this community? Is this really a place, like, should I take space here?
Yeah.
And those networks, like with Arsenal Pulp, like being published with them, it's sort of a reminder, just the way that writing to you and hearing such a positive response back, even though we hadn't met in person, reminded me that, in fact, this is a very welcoming community, and it's one that's predicated on care and uplifting and holding and these things that capitalism doesn't allow us to feel.
No, not at all.
White supremacy doesn't allow us to feel. And that is so radical and that is so powerful. So to be published by Arsenal Pulp is a gift, because it's another example of being held.
Yep, absolutely. And I think I can't even express the words I wanted to say there. I think about this aspect of like radical care, and I think one thing I love about your book, and especially because it roots it like illness within this lens of queerness, and so it has this kind of promiscuity to care, of like your care is so expansive and what communities you're pulling in, and how, again, like this generosity of what you're sharing with the audience, that it allows so many different intersectional beings to just feel like upheld in that space that you're building in your book. That's such a tender place to be like, I love this idea of promiscuity with care, right? That it's not, care doesn't exist in a lens of scarcity, even though capitalism and white supremacy teaches us that absolutely, right? That we have to be close held with our care is limited, our care is held only for those, whether that's a nuclear family structure or otherwise. And it's all built in these like heteropatriarchal systems. And we get to dismantle that through promiscuous care. That we get to say that every being is welcome in this space, and that we will hold and make space for them. Like that's what it comes down to, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and it's the best. It's so like warm to get to hold that space together, and like to feel like we're building those kind of networks and frameworks together. And
yeah, and the way that it doesn't feel like it doesn't deplete in the ways that capitalism would tell us that it will.
Yeah.
That it in fact energizes and strengthens and cushions and all of these.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you're right, like when I think about these modes of care, or when I'm in community, it's never an exhaustive, depleting system, right? Even though capitalism does want us to believe that any system of outpouring of care is going to be extractive and exhausting to us. And instead, it's the opposite. It is always energizing. I feel the best when I am in community, and particularly in community with Crip community, because to me, that is the most radical space of care that we can hold together, that we can have this like revolutionary space where we're constantly extending care networks to each other. And they don't have to fall within this like nuclear family, cis-het systems that we've established of care. That it can be more than that, that we get to have our chosen family, and that's also expansive. It's just magic. It's queer Crip magic.
Just magic. Sleeping with house guest. The vestibule of the mouth, guests milling, no room to even move the tongue, a whole new flora, licking fingers after turning sourdough, and on the carpet of your gums, microbes dance or die, a duel in the Russian winter. Despite not being a novel, you imagine them spinning in their own dramas. Film develops, hangs in the snoring dry, dark room, your cavity you cannot pour into. It just takes a little light behind it to see, the way a dream does, how empty sirens are in sleep, and how sticky the smell of morning. Shuddering from your mouth after a night of mushroom hunting, you spore and hope some of them take, among the fallen logs and ferns, along the water of your tired and neglected gut, the acid yellowing the stony scar tissue, you go down with your hands full and scattered. Resting, a place only you know, you get there by swallowing, carried down by pain, soft furs on the water, the few that are left, and the ones who came without your permission. They move so much faster, grow impatient, want to see something violent. You cannot kill a parasite at the root. So where parts 1 and 2 of the book are quite close shots of me, part 3 zooms out onto the world to ask what it might mean to be sick in a world that is itself also sick. Themes from the first 2 sections, queerness and illness, come up against the collapse of the world here. Climate change, environmental racism, colonialism, capitalism. In this section, I try to chart what seems to be a reasonable response to living in a sick, unjust world. But then the section flips, and the poems are suddenly justified to the right of the page, and I look out onto a different world, one that's predicated on care and relationship and hope and joy as a way of looking out onto a world that I want for all of us. Ruinous women. Because in the footprints of ruinous women, rainwater floods and throats sing, and we are held by ruinous women. Surviving in my queer body only because of ruinous women. Generations of genders accumulate and stitch care up and down time, a return. All the women I know and love have ruined something for the better, ruined me for the better, made openings. The best parts of this world are the women who want to ruin it, so fiercely and attentively, gutting it with their starter and SCOBY. It is laughter from the future, finally the sound of the other side of shattering. I was so fortunate to work with my dear friend Joshua Whitehead, a Two-Spirit Oji-nêhiyaw writer, on this collection where he was my editor. There was nobody else that I wanted to work with. Josh's writing on the body, on queerness, on kinship has been so foundational to me, so inspirational, and his friendship has been so formative as I do the ongoing work of coming to love my queerness. And Josh helped me tremendously in this work with this book, and it would not be the book that it is without him. I love him.
So you open this morning with the line, "My senses are misfiring in the domestic." And you have a lot of disarray in the domestic spaces, right? And you and I have talked about the domestic space as maybe like sites of haunting and pain. Like for example, when you were reading the early bits of Making Love with the Land, we were talking about like how a nail hole can bleed and like can scream even when it's laced with loss. And we begin in the domestic in Swollening, and we move through like a multitude of homes as we continue on. But I'm very interested to know, like, what is your sense of the domestic, as someone with chronic pain or as a queer person? So like, how does that figure into your thinking and or your writing?
Yeah, what a question, and it is something that we really grappled with a lot together as we were editing it. And I think as I revisit Swollening now and refamiliarize myself with it from this new perspective, where I have written it so long ago, I'm no longer editing it with you. I mean, it sort of feels like I'm a little bit more distanced from it. And I'm coming to see it as a collection that's marking a kind of reckoning and mourning, but always trying to move toward hope. And I think for many queer people of our generation and older especially, like the home hasn't always been a space of protection or safety or even honesty. Like it wasn't a place where we could let our guards down, or indeed it was also a place for some of us where our guard was actually up the most. It was most heightened. and it may have been easier to be our true queer selves outside of the home, and then it's a place where we retreat back into this other role and regress a little bit, and like another persona who is maybe more legible to our families when we arrive back. And so the first section of the book is really interested in childhood and adolescence, growing up queer in Alberta, which for me at the time was a space of disorganization and like disunity and disarray, as you say. Like home is a really fraught place for queer people sometimes. And so at this stage of my life as a queer person with chronic illness, like home means something different now from this vantage point. You know, looking back on the collection, it's a place that now I'm able to make for myself, where I can be my true self without compromise, where I make the invitations as to who's invited in and when. It's a place that I recover. And it's very much on my own terms and also on the terms of other queer and sick, disabled, crip people who are striving toward liberation and joy. And so like, yeah, revisiting the collection, I see a lot of the pain and grief that came with getting here, a lot of those ways that those holes, those nail holes are screaming, those are wounds. But, you know, you and I made the decision to close the book with a final section that returns us to the domestic with the title, like the title of the third section is "If I Had a Window, It Would Be Open." You know, that's another, it's a return to the domestic, to this unit of a house, and at a place of hope within the collection. Like it's opening up and looking out onto a world that we can make for ourselves in our own image, that cares for us and our needs. And so the home that I'm invested in now, that I'm writing toward now, is more joyful and more liberatory and safe.
No, I 100% agree. Like the home can be so like a space of refuge, also a space of like rejuvenation. And just, you're talking about like the home as like Alberta, the home as like a literal home. You're in another home with glass bookshop. And this was a question I didn't get to ask, and maybe I'll just throw a curveball in. But what is it, in thinking of another home, which figures large and swollening, what about a home in a body, and specifically like the body that you're writing about in swollening?
Yeah, I think one of the things about, for me, this collection is that, again, it's like, it's so mournful looking back. And I think what I was trying to write through was an understanding in myself that I did feel alienated and not at home in my body. Like sickness did change my relationship to my body, and it changed how I feel within it, how my body bumps against the rest of the world. And so therefore how I, as like, you know, an internalized being, bumps against this external sort of this world. And so I think what I am really grateful for this collection for doing is giving me that space to have those feelings that are just about coming to terms with the fact that like sometimes your body has other plans for you. And it's not about, for me anymore, it's not about trying to force a type of home, but rather making home in the body that I have, recognizing that the life that I had before I was sick, like that's not going to be my life anymore. And the type of home that I imagine for myself in my body is going to need to change. And what I've learned since writing it, and now talking to more people about it, particularly queer folks or sick and disabled and crip folks, is that that it doesn't have to be, it's not a hopeless sort of place to be, to redefine the terms of home in your body, homing in your body. That in fact, redefining those terms as somebody who's sick actually opens me up to more care, because I feel as though white capitalism and colonialism, it really individualizes us. and it makes our bodies and our homes kind of silos. This is my home, this is my body. And instead, to be sick and to be queer is to say, like, my body is also your body. It's like in relation to your body, like we are all kind of striving together. And that doesn't always play out, but that to me is like the utopian hope. So I don't know, does that answer the question at hand?
I love those thoughts. And like, as just something that's on my mind, like in this week of like National Eating Disorder Week, and having conversations with a good friend of mine the other night, and asking like, what does it feel? It must be so liberating to move through the world in such a way is that you're not in pain, and physical or mental. And I was like, what does that feel like? And this person had never thought of it. And he was like, well, I just kind of think of my body as like the machine that moves my mind. I was like, if only I could think like that. Because like every time I get up or move, or move through the world, like my body's I'm very cognizant of my body. So like, yeah, the kind of the ignorance of being able to be embodied, but also feeling mentally bodiless or physically bodiless. That sounds utopic to me, but also like that is not a type of space that I could move into. And that's something I touched quite a bit on in my forthcoming book of nonfiction, of thinking about the body. It just figures so primarily, I would say. And so like, I'm always thinking about what Billy Ray Belcourt says when writing about nonfiction or memoir, which your book has also been called both a kind of hybrid of poetry and memoir. And Billy Ray Belcourt says, it's like, I was just so inside of my life when writing This Wound is a World. Sorry, not This Wound is a World. And when writing A History of My Brief Body, he was so inside of his life that he couldn't, experience the exteriority of it all. And I'm interested, so with swollening, a little bit about genre here. And I always conflate it with gender. And I always conflate it, and I tell my students this, if we're going to be decolonial in a kind of literal praxis of not, respecting or, seeing nations, territories, provinces, we also need to be kind of decolonial on the page. And so we don't kind of go beyond form or genre and blend. I'm a bit of a genre outlaw myself, as a poet, novelist, essayist, nonfiction writer. So like, tell me a little bit about genre in swollening, like the fusion of it all, and what was your experiences with that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, leave it to Billy to give language to that really complicated space so perfectly, huh? And like, that's such a beautiful question, and it's something that I think I've had conversations with several friends about different writing projects and how they are, sort of, not playing by the rules of genre. And I think there's something to that connection between genre and gender that you make in your question. Because as a queer and chronically ill person, my relationship to my body has always been kind of mediated by dominant, white, ableist, heteropatriarchal, capitalist culture. And like all of ours have been. And so for me, as I settle more into my identities as queer and sick, that discomfort and misalignment in the space between modes of bodily expression that are prescribed to me and the realities of my embodiment become much more pronounced. So like, this is the same with gender. Like, the more attention and care that I paid toward my body, the more aware I was that these binaries that, were made to live within don't serve us as much as they serve a way of like organizing our bodies for the white capitalist colonial project, right? And so I've always known myself to be non-binary, and it's thanks to the examples and permission afforded to me by queer and crip community that I was able to claim that space. And so I think something similar happens with genre. Like, I think, yes, the book is described both as poetry and memoir because I'm the subject. And aside from a brief departure in the third section where I zoom out, it's really deeply personal. And while poetic in form, certainly, and in tradition, and like, there's a really confessional memoirist slant to the book. And I have been, so many people, as I and we have worked on this book together. I mean, the person that I was writing it is not the person I was, editing it is not the person I am now. And there were parts of me that were hiding throughout every stage. Like I remember you and I having so many conversations about what it was I was really trying to say, like what it was I was really meaning. Because I would have this vague poetic language. I was using this form to sort of elide some of the truths or the maybe more memoirist biographical truths. So I think what was really interesting about being in that space with you was that you awakened me to the fact that this book sits at this intersection of poetry and memoir, and perhaps, you know, other genres too. But more than genre, yeah, I think it's become more useful for me to think about writing as being part of traditions or maybe as schools, because I think of myself very much as a student right now. Like that is the mind frame I'm in, where I'm still learning myself as a queer, non-binary person, as a Sikh person, and I'm still learning that I'm actually a part of a number of different communities that certainly intersect, but also sort of have their own, not necessarily projects or ethics, but I mean have their own qualities and hopes, and I think that, you know, this book in the same way is part of these numerous communities that inform it and hold it, just the way that I'm held by being part of these communities. And I think of, like, you know, writers like you, or Billy, or Ocean Vuong, or like so many amazing writers who have given me an example of what's possible. My gender. A cookbook, half open on the couch, that blows the soft herbs, drip in sensual memory coming hither on the teeth. The way the coconut and its milk announce themselves exactly as they are, its solids on the fingers. I would like to substitute myself thoughtfully, as when forgetting to pick up cilantro, and so basil instead, infusing the meal at the last minute, when it all seems like it could be too late. A little change, a swap, into the same, but it's silly to make this into an equation. But here, scribbled on the counter as I cook dinner for only myself, no one here to see how I stir, how I adapt what I've been given, the recipe as it should be, and fine that way, and how I've always been taught to eat it, but then to learn I prefer this other way. In the garden with my faggots, who teach me to laugh with each of my teeth, to pearl them among the pansies, to pluck from my brows the masculinity I have covered my vision with, to line my eyes with wrinkles, who I sit with and nourish myself with what we've grown, chard and radish and mint, to heal with honey and hot broth, who help me return to the comfort of proximity to bodies, of belonging to bodies, to a chorus of voices that includes mine, gathered in mounds of blankets and draped in smoke, to breathe in, to love that I'm alive. And that's it.
That's it.
That's Swollening. Please buy it.